Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Marta McDowell. Marta is the wife of our very own Old Guard member, Kirke Bent, who I would like to publicly thank for volunteering Marta. More importantly, I would like to thank Marta for agreeing to speak to us today. Marta was originally an executive with the Prudential in Newark. She left the corporate world to pursue her new passion, being an author and a gardener. She's a prolific author, a lecturer, advisor, teacher, landscape consultant, and gardener. Kirke sums up his wife's bio as, "I am, therefore I dig." Marta has authored 10 books, including the one that she will present on today, All the President's Gardens, which is a New York Times bestseller. She has another book, Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life, that won a gold award from the Garden Writers Association and has sold well over 100,000 copies. Her books have been translated into Chinese, Japanese, Italian, and Korean. Marta has interned in several gardens/arboretums in New Jersey, one in Devon, England, and another in London. She worked as a horticulturalist for 5 years at our very own Summit Reeves Reed Arboretum. She is the 2019 recipient of the Garden Club of America's Sarah Chapman Francis Medal for Outstanding Literary Achievement. Her own personal garden in Chatham, New Jersey, is included in the Smithsonian Archive of American Gardens. Please join me in welcoming Marta McDowell.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you all for having me. Let's see if we can get our screen working. It's very hard for left-handed people. Here we go. Whoop, there we go. And just get me to the next one. Thank you, Joel. Okay, now we're cooking. So, as Lee told you all, I've written a lot of books. They tend to be books about authors who garden, right? I've written books about Emily Dickinson and Beatrix Potter. I've written books about the author of The Secret Garden, Frances Hodgson Burnett, and I've written a book about garden murder mysteries called Gardening Can Be Murder. And it can. This one is a little off that track, and it wasn't on purpose. One day I called my editor there in Portland, Oregon, and I said, "Tom, I would be interested in writing a book about all those people in Concord, Massachusetts. I'm sure you can name some of them. Emerson, who else? Thoreau, the Alcotts were there, Nathaniel Hawthorne was there." Tom said to me, this is on the phone, "Gee, that sounds interesting. I'd buy it, but I don't think anyone else would." Okay. He said, what about a history of American gardening? Now, this was about, I don't know, let's say 12, 15 years ago. And I envisioned the rest of my life spending on this giant tome about the history of American gardening. And a few weeks later, I called him back and said, "Well, would you consider a book about the history of American gardening as seen through the White House?" So he agreed, and off we went. So I like to have, when I'm writing a book, some little personal connection to the topic. And no one in my family was ever in the White House, either upstairs or downstairs, as you know, as a part of their employment. But I did find this picture. This is the White House. So it's the south portico, the rounded one, the backyard, if you will. It's probably around 1915, 1920. And in the, let's see, the bottom left corner are hydrangeas. Among my family photos, I had this one. The woman in the sunbonnet is my grandmother, Catherine Nealon Ryan. She was born in County Clare, came across the Atlantic as a teenager somehow made her way to central Illinois, that's Lincoln, Illinois. Note the hydrangea, right? Probably a different species, but sort of the same placement. It was a little reminder that fashions, including garden fashions, spread around the country, often led by the White House. The little girl is my mother. She was born in 1921. So we'll start at the beginning with the president's house. So George Washington is, laying out the federal city, this new city, and he has some help from a Frenchman named Pierre Charles L'Enfant, now mostly remembered because of a metro stop in Washington, D.C., named after him. But L'Enfant was an engineer. He was born in a little town called Versailles. He was trained in Paris. He came with Lafayette as part of the French troops helping the American army. And so he gets this job consulting on a new federal city. So he lays out a French city, right? If you think of the city of Washington, it has a lot of these long boulevards, very axial, right? Think of Versailles, those long views. It has these circles. It's very geometric. It is why the city is almost impossible to drive around. Even Google gets confused. And he wanted to put the president's house at the end of one of those long boulevards. Washington, however, had other ideas. He said, no, I want it to be up on that rise of land so that the air will be better and the views will be better. And there is a little hill if you go to Washington today and see the White House. And so that is where it stands. It is also the reason why Pennsylvania Avenue, if you walk down from, say, the National Archives to the White House, you have to take this dog leg. It sort of bends. Pennsylvania Avenue moves. And that's the whole reason why. So, did George Washington ever live in the White House? No, absolutely not. The first president to live in the White House was John Adams. Very good. So John Adams moves in. It's November. It's toward the end of his first term. His wife, Abigail, joins him about 2 weeks later. And Abigail Adams sits down and writes a letter with the right hand to her daughter back in Massachusetts and talks about, let's call it the yard. She said, "We have not the least fence, yard, or other convenience." In other words, not much of a garden, because when the Adams, John and Abigail, move into the president's house, it is not finished. In fact, Abigail Adams includes in that letter, "I am hanging my wet laundry to dry in the unfinished receiving rooms." So it was basically a construction site. She even mentions the ride into town. She said, "Woods are all you can see from Baltimore until you reach the city," and that's underlined, "which is so only in name." It's a little reminder that the city of Washington, D.C. was built basically on farmland, swamp, and a few villages like Georgetown that were already there. So John and Abigail did not suffer the situation for long because John Adams loses the election at the end of 1800. And the following year, in comes their sometimes friend, sometimes enemy, Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson was a lifelong gardener. I thought, well, when I get to Jefferson, this will be easy because he gardened constantly at Monticello and what I think of as his retirement plantation, Poplar Forest. And so I figured, well, he would have been a gardener when he was president. That was only sort of true. He was busy finishing the construction of the government building. So he concentrated on that all around the city. He did some street tree planting. So if you're involved with a shade tree commission in your town, you are in good company with Thomas Jefferson. And he did some indoor gardening while he was president. In his office, which is now actually the state dining room, he had in the windows some kind of plant stands. And we know this because a friend of his, Margaret Bayard Smith, wrote it down. And she talks about geraniums growing in the window. Now, nowadays, geraniums you can buy anywhere. You can buy them at Costco, you can buy them at the Acme. But then it was really a rare imported plant. It was from South Africa. She also mentions that he had on these plant stands some kind of roses, and she doesn't say what kind. They must have been a miniature, right, to grow indoors. But really, my favorite part was she said on the plant stands, there was also a bird cage for his pet mockingbird. We even know the name of this mockingbird during Jefferson's presidency. The bird's name was Dick, which I thought was very funny when I read that on the Monticello website. And Dick, evidently a good mimic, would sing along when Jefferson played the violin. Okay, Jefferson is a two-term president, and he does get a little involved with the grounds. So in 1807, he and architect Benjamin Latrobe draw up a landscape plan for the president's house and basically set the front and backyard. So the front is the north portico. That was to be the formal carriage entrance. And it was a very French sort of layout, very formal. The back was much more relaxed, much more English landscape style. And on the plan, in Jefferson's handwriting, he has written words like groves and shrubberies, right? This would be much more like Downton Abbey, if you will. So Jefferson does the planning. The next president, James Madison, does the planting. And during his administration, all sorts of orders go out for seeds and for ornamental plants. So the ornamental plants are things we still grow: lilacs, rose of Sharon, lots of trees. The vegetables were sort of like a mini farm at the time, right on the grounds of the president's house, because he was supplying the table at the time. 1812, the British march into the federal city and they burn the federal buildings, including the White House, or at the time still called the President's House. Whoops. Slight technical difficulty. There we go. Okay. And so it is replanted and the building is rebuilt during the next administration, that of James Monroe. It is at that point that this building, which was sort of charred from that fire, was given a very bright white coat of paint. And so in the 1820s, it started to be called that White House because it was very white up on that little rise of land. And eventually that becomes the formal name of the president's house, which we now still call the White House. It's about that time that you start to see pictures of ornamental gardening at the White House. And I'm particularly fond of this image because it has people just sort of strolling around the grounds. There's a fellow walking his dog. You can see one method they used to keep the lawn mowed and, I suppose, fertilized at the same time. A neighbor would bring in a flock of sheep, and we see a person gardening. At this period, it would have been an Irishman named John Ousley. Again, he's an immigrant. He comes to America as an adult, comes in through South Amboy, New Jersey, makes his way to the nation's capital, gets a job at the White House, where he stays for 27 years. He taught a president how to garden. Now, John Quincy Adams, the son of John and Abigail, he was a very learned man. He had been a diplomat. He was a lawyer. He taught at Harvard Law School. When he gets into the White House, I think he's sort of depressed. He won an election only sort of in 1824. There was a large, group of contenders. He and Andrew Jackson were the front runners. It was a draw. So the election gets thrown to the House of Representatives. The other contenders come in behind John Quincy Adams, and so he is made president. Jackson supporters call it the corrupt bargain, and they just fight him his whole presidency. And in his diaries, you can just see he's just not getting anything done. He's not getting any action. And he starts to talk about the garden and the gardener, Mr. Ousley. His diaries, if you want to read them, they are all available online thanks to the Massachusetts Historical Society. There are about 40 volumes of them. So it can give you good reading material for the winter. But it gives a lot of information. He talks about the gardener as his nomenclator. He starts to learn about the botanical names of plants. He gets very, very fascinated with trees. And at the Historical Society in Boston, as I was going through microfilm, do you remember microfilm, right? It was an actual film. You put it on the carousel, you go around. It's all in black and white. And I pop up with this picture, which I have never seen online, proof that the good stuff is always buried in the archive somewhere. And I get very excited because it's clearly an image of a little seedling in a pot. And in Quincy Adams' handwriting is the propagation record for this apple tree. And there it is in color, thanks to the archivist who found that, of a seed of an apple that he planted in 1827. So if he were up here in New Providence, he'd be going around the cemetery and the grounds looking for tree seeds because he planted a lot of those at the White House grounds. He also started America's first forestry project with live oaks planted on the Florida Panhandle. Okay, John Quincy Adams, a one-term president, and in comes roaring, you guessed it, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a populist. He had a lot of backing. They were loud and enthusiastic. And I know he was cool because I found this on the internet. Yes, indeed. Positive proof that we have too much time on our hands. Jackson, when he's inaugurated, there is a really boisterous party, so crowded that they worried for the new president's safety. So the next time you're planning a party, I don't know if this will apply to next week's Christmas party, but if it gets too crowded, you move the whiskey out to the garden, and that will solve your problem. The true point of fact is Jackson would have been in mourning right at this time because his wife Rachel died just before he was coming to Washington to be sworn in. So he was coming from his plantation in Tennessee, and she dies suddenly. The story is that he brought either cuttings or saplings of southern magnolia and had them planted next to the south portico. They have recently been removed. They were in really terrible shape. Think of how old these were, right? These are, basically from 1830. I will say they were on the old Jackson 20, if you come up with one of those, and saplings that were propagated from the original Jackson magnolia have been replanted this year on the White House grounds. So removed in April, and there's the new one going in, replanted also in April. So now we are going to do some time travel because otherwise we will be here until this afternoon. And I'll move forward. Here are the 1850s, basically. You'll see still roses planted on the front grounds near the north portico. And we will land briefly on the presidency of James Buchanan. James Buchanan is right before Abraham Lincoln, right? So this is just before the Civil War. He was from Pennsylvania. He was a lawyer and a longtime politician. He'd been Secretary of State. He was a bachelor. So when he comes to the White House as president, he brings with him his niece and one of his wards, Harriet Lane. Buchanan raised a niece and nephew because their parents died. Harriet Lane was, my equivalent would have been Princess Diana. She was the kind of celebrity, politician, if you will, hostess. And the newspapers followed everything she did, what she wore, the kinds of flowers she liked, the kind of music she danced to, and the fact that her uncle had built on the west side of the White House a proper conservatory for the display of ornamental plants. This was all the nuts at the time. And so, again, very popular, and it spreads all around the country. That conservatory shows up in old images. So this is one from the early 1860s, and the glass house is stuck right on the left side of this photograph. It's on the west side, so where the West Wing is today, there was a big plant conservatory. Again, this is the backyard of the White House, the South Lawn. You'll see an old retaining wall that was put in during the Jefferson administration, and you will also note that we did not invent graffiti in the 20th century. That is 19th century graffiti. So there it is. Mrs. Lincoln loved flowers. She is shown generally adorned with some sort of floral headpiece or corsage. And she was also redecorating the White House, and she loved to buy clothes. Now, in terms of the redecoration, she quickly ran through the appropriation from Congress. And so the creditors were starting to knock on the door. Now, the gardener at the time, his name was John Watt, said something to the effect of, don't worry, Mrs. Lincoln, you just charge all of those bills to the grounds account, and I'll make it look as though I bought more plants and manure and things like that. Now, if there are any accountants in the house, you will know this is a no-no. Congress got wind of it. They called it the Manure Fund. Mr. Watt was fired, and I don't know what happened to the bills. I assume the president paid them. In researching this book, I spent a lot of time in the National Archives. So I came up with this old map. This was in College Park, Maryland, where the maps are held of the White House grounds, as they were at the time. So mid 1860s. Now, can I see the cursor, Joel? Okay. So here's the White House. There are that kind of L shape. That is the glass house complex at the time. But I was particularly taken with this sort of, I'll call it a squash or cello shaped drive. And then these two circles on either side. That was a driveway. And I had read this sort of tirade by a congressman who called something on the grounds of the White House Amazon's bosoms. And if you sort of stare at this map, you kind of get the idea. And it's these two round hills that were built there. Anyway, moving right along. Okay, again, we'll jump forward a bit to Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio. I now remember Rutherford B. rhymes with tree because tree planting, the commemorative kind of tree planting, started during the Hayes administration and still goes on today. They also started the Easter egg roll. President Hayes and his wife, Lucy Webb Hayes, were temperance advocates. Temperance advocates. Now, this is way before Prohibition, but during the Hayes administration, the White House was dry. No liquor served. This was not popular with everyone, including their Secretary of State, who said of one of their parties, "It was a brilliant affair. The water flowed like champagne." Can't please everyone. So instead of, offering an after dinner drink, the president and first lady would get up at the end of a meal and usher people through new doors that had been punched in to the glass houses. And I guess you'd get a tour of the plants, and then the party was over. Their head gardener was Henry Pfister. He was from Switzerland. He had worked for them first in Ohio and then came with them to the White House, where again, he stays for over 20 years. He was responsible for all of the glass house maintenance, the crew to keep the heat on and the plants looking good, and also the ornamental grounds outside, which at the time, I think of as sort of Victorian style, big potted palms, carpet bedding, that sort of thing. So this is looking out the front door of the White House to Lafayette Square, to the equestrian statue of Andrew Jackson, still there, although the garden looks quite different. The conservatories kept growing. So they grow and grow. It's finally this sort of massive city under glass during the Cleveland administration. They grew all of the flowers for cutting. They grew all of the plants to plant outside, as well as having display greenhouses inside. So it was really extensive. Many of the presidents and first ladies loved the glass houses, visited, commented. Here's Mrs. McKinley in the glass houses. President McKinley loved carnations, so the gardeners would bring him fresh carnations every morning. McKinley, sadly, is one of our presidents who was assassinated. He was shot in Buffalo. He was opening a World's Fair, and he died about a week later. For many years, America celebrated Carnation Day on his birthday, January 29th, although that tradition has sort of gone away. When McKinley died, who became president? Oh, very good. We've got historians. Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was young. This was a big change. A very young president with a big family. This becomes important to the garden because all of those children filled up the White House upstairs. And Teddy Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, said, I have no place to work, right? The rooms on the first floor are the public rooms. Rooms upstairs are full of children. I need more space. So he calls Charles McKim of McKim, Mead and White, a famous architect firm in New York, and says, help us out. That is when the glass houses go away. And the predecessor to the east and west wings are added. And then the gardens change. So here is the new East Garden in the time of the Roosevelts. Teddy Roosevelt and his wife like to have breakfast under those awnings on the south portico and then stroll in this colonial revival garden after their breakfast. And there is the First Lady. The Tafts, Mrs. Taft, brought another major plant contribution to the city in the form of the cherry blossoms. She was lobbied hard by one member of the Department of Agriculture and a journalist, and she worked with Japan, the Imperial Japan, to send over cherries, which they did actually twice because the first batch had insects and had to be burned. Oops. The Wilsons. So there are two Mrs. Wilsons. The first Mrs. Wilson, she had lived at Princeton when Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton University. She had a garden there. She was an artist. When she moves in as First Lady, she doesn't want a colonial revival garden like Teddy Roosevelt and his wife. She wants now Italianate, a new style. So she hires a designer, Beatrix Jones Farrand, who designs this garden to replace the East Garden. Unfortunately, the first Mrs. Wilson dies before the garden goes in. And so it is the second Mrs. Wilson. Woodrow Wilson remarried a year later, and the second Mrs. Wilson has the garden installed. And there is the president and the First Lady in that garden. Very beautiful. Now, of course, during the Wilson administration was the First World War. Sheep came back briefly to the White House grounds. And between the wars, we have, sort of that kind of flapper era. I love Mrs. Harding's dress, and her big feathered hat. And she is congratulating the winner of the tennis match because we now have recreational facilities coming into the White House grounds, just as many of us have that basketball hoop up during the time when children are a certain age. So tennis courts. The Hardings were in the newspaper business and they knew how to work the press. They had lots of press conferences, invited lots of famous people to the White House. And a favorite sort of candidate for press conferences was their Airedale Laddie Boy, a famous first canine. He is a cute dog, but I put in this picture because of the trellis work in the back. That was the rose garden that was already in place during the Harding administration on the west side. So there's long been a rose garden there. We're going to skip FDR, not that I don't love him, and Eleanor, but he's in the book, but just in the interests of time, and go to Truman. Truman wanted some privacy at the White House, not an easy thing. So he goes to Congress with two little architectural models, which you see here. The one on the top was how it was at the time. The South Portico had those big awnings. What Truman wanted was the one on the bottom. Take off the awnings, put in a balcony off of the second floor. So they argue about it, he and Congress, for a while, but eventually Congress says, okay, Harry can have his porch. And it's put on for $10,000, which seems like a real bargain these days. I can barely call a plumber for that. Bess Truman and Harry Truman did not really enjoy it for long because the White House was starting to have structural problems at the time. And so they were actually evacuated to Blair House, where they lived for quite a few, I think a couple of years, until the construction could sort of fix things. So the White House is essentially rebuilt around 1950. And when they're about to move back in, Truman orders a kind of instant garden. He was expecting, I think it was the Queen of the Netherlands. And so it's sort of rolled out, right? The sod is all rolled out. Look at the size of these boxwoods. The next time you look at a newscast, your newscast of choice, talking about the White House, they will likely have a picture of the North Portico, the one with the pediment, and at the bottom of the columns, you'll see boxwoods. Those are the Truman boxwoods. They're still alive. Our taxpayer dollars went well. Made a lot of, it was worthwhile, let's just say, still there. Okay, during the Eisenhower administration, Dwight Eisenhower loved to play golf. So a putting green was installed. Strangely, I could not find a picture of President Eisenhower putting on the putting green, including I called the USGA, out in Bedminster or wherever it is. But I did find a cartoon. There is the president lining up his putt. And with apologies to President Eisenhower, a squirrel has dropped an acorn from the oak tree and it has landed on his head. You'll notice he misses his putt. During the Eisenhower administration, there actually was an attempt to trap and transport all of the squirrels from the White House grounds. And I am not making this up, someone in Congress started a Save the Squirrels campaign. So, things still happen. So I remember Jacqueline Kennedy's tour of the interior of the White House, but it was President Kennedy who wanted to upgrade the gardens. They had visited Paris, they'd seen Versailles, they went to Buckingham Palace and were guests of the Queen. And he looked out of his Oval Office windows and said, this is looking a little shabby. So he calls a friend of theirs, Rachel Lambert Mellon. Bunny Mellon was a famous garden designer, and she and President Kennedy worked together on the design for a garden. that was going to go in right outside the West Wing. And it is what we call today the Rose Garden. But it's interesting what you find when you start digging there. So they came up with horseshoes from the old stables, bits of the old glass houses, and one day cut through the national security defense line and triggered an atomic alert. This is actually true. It's just before the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a lot of tension. And so the moral of the story is call before you dig, right? Call before you dig. Doesn't matter where you are, call before you dig. Okay. The Rose Garden was extremely successful. It was immediately, the press loved it. Kennedy started having his press conferences there. There are roses in this planting. You can't tell because they're all pruned down. And so what you see, of course, in the spring are the tulips and the Catherine crab apples. Oops, wrong way. It was so popular that the Kennedys said, could you design an East garden for us as well? And Mrs. Mellon indeed did that. It was about to go in when the Kennedys left for Dallas. So there are some very poignant letters between the landscape architect and the nurseryman who was working on this about the feeling of the country at the time. And again, I remember that myself. So this garden was installed during the Johnson administration and dedicated to Jacqueline Kennedy, which is why it's sometimes called the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden. Mrs. Johnson was very well known for her beautification efforts around the city, around the country, and of course, her wildflower initiative. The gardens have been used by so many presidents for so many things. One of the Nixon daughters got married out in the Rose Garden. The bicentennial party was held in a tent in the Rose Garden. This is President Ford toasting the Queen, may she rest in peace, and Vice President anyone? Nelson Rockefeller, there you go. The Queen was very kind of brave that day. And she said in her toast, Mr. President, history is not a fairy tale. And she went on to describe the British burning of Washington, D.C., which seemed like kind of nervy to me. But anyway, it's been used for diplomacy, for many, many different children. Here's Jimmy Carter with his daughter, Amy, and one of his grandsons. They were generationally, stretched out. For many first canines, Barbara Bush with Millie. Remember when Millie had puppies? It was a really big story. Mrs. Bush and her daughter-in-law are, as far as I know, the only two first ladies who have been members of the Garden Club. During the Clinton administration, there was a series of American sculpture exhibits in the East Garden. And tree planting continues to this day. This was George and Laura Bush planting a tree on the front yard. The trees at the White House I found very, very impressive. They're beautiful specimens. The oldest one is from just before 1900. It's an old Japanese maple. During the Obama administration, vegetables came back to the White House grounds. They had not been there probably since around 1900. And of course, there have been changes to the Rose Garden. So during the first Trump administration, a long researched renovation was put in at the Rose Garden. The Catherine crab apples were removed. I will say it is very difficult to grow roses under trees. So as beautiful as those crabapple trees were, it was always a problem with the roses. So there's Rose Garden work going on during the Biden administration. And the most recent renovation of the Rose Garden, which, is up, you have to decide. What do you think about that? I will leave that to you. And who knows what's next? Well, we know what's next is big changes to the east side of the White House, but I have not seen those. And those are still, sort of open to what's going to happen. So I did not fly a plane onto the White House grounds. I did not climb the fence. That was not me. I did need some help to get access to the White House. And I was very fortunate because Rodney Frelinghuysen was our representative, and he and his staff really helped me. First, by getting us tickets to the Spring Garden Day that year, which was 2014. It's a wonderful thing to do if you've never done it, to go to one of the White House garden tours. They generally have them spring and fall. You will have to ask your member of Congress when. It's a little hard to find out sometimes. You will be with a lot of your fellow Americans. Can you see the crowd that day? But it was very, very well run. The problem was you couldn't get close up to a lot of things. That was as close as you could get to the Rose Garden that day. So Representative Frelinghuysen helped me get an interview with the head of horticulture, who's just out of this picture, Jim Adams. It was a day when the first family was not in residence. They were on vacation. And you can see it's a beehive of activity. They're replacing plants, doing a lot of work. But I was able to get up close to the gardens, including the vegetable garden, which had the best plant labels I'd ever seen because the White House calligrapher had written them all. You can see they're real gardeners. He's checking the temperature of the compost bin, and he also has his pockets stuffed with things that he's been deadheading. They're in the green and gray. They are National Park Service employees because the White House grounds are considered a national park. So it's a very interesting history, very rich over time. I hope you can agree that it's a part of our common heritage. So wherever you are on the spectrum politically, I think we can agree that it is full of tradition and part of our sort of national heritage. Beautiful at any time of year, especially I think in the spring. And I will just finish with my favorite quote from the whole book from a long service gardener, Irv Williams. He was head gardener from the Kennedy administration to George W. Bush. So a long time. And he said of the job, what's great about the job is that our trees, our plants, our shrubs know nothing about politics. Thank you.
I was blown away by your presentation, so thank you so much. So I'll kick it off with a question I have. I think you mentioned hydrangeas early in your presentation, and I thought in a later photo, maybe it was around the Kennedy era, I thought I saw some hydrangeas there. So do we still have hydrangeas at the White House, and are they still in fashion? And will I be in fashion if I put in a couple more hydrangeas at my house?
So I have to answer the first part of your question, Rich, with a caveat. I do not know if there are still hydrangeas there because it has been a while since I have been on the White House grounds. But my guess would be yes, they are very hardy shrubs and they bloom for a very long period of time. Particularly as long as they get adequate water. That's the one thing I find with my hydrangeas is if they're not adequately irrigated, they kind of droop. But yes, my guess would be yes. I don't know, honestly.
Well, thank you. Great presentation. I was going to ask you about how to get rid of deer in my garden.
I'll be happy to. Like the White House, you need a really big fence.
I'll spare you that. Can you tell us about the process of writing your book, how long it took? Did you have to go to all these government agencies? You mentioned the archives and the maps and all that. Can you briefly describe it?
So generally it takes me about 3 years end to end to get a book done, with about a year of research, although true confession, I sort of write as I go. I spent a lot of time in the National Archives. One would think that the White House records of their landscape would be all in one place. Ha ha, not so. the responsibility for gardening at the White House moved. It was sometimes the responsibility of the Army or another, another department, and then eventually it gets to the national park, and it was spread all over the place. So a lot of it was spent, going back through various documents and other sources to find things. So the archivists are great. The people at the National Archives were great. And that's where I did most of my work, some at the Library of Congress.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm curious, what is the size of the grounds? Because you say they're always planting trees there. Well, trees grow to take up a lot of space.
Yeah.
So is it a large, what's the size of it? Or are they cutting down older trees in order to plant newer ones for commemorative purposes?
Yeah, it's around 15 acres. So it's a good size, and they only really cut trees down, if they are diseased in some way. For example, there was a very old elm tree that it was thought, though not documented, but it was thought that John Quincy Adams had planted it. It was removed after a second lightning strike. So, again, they had a propagate of it. So they had essentially taken a branch, grafted it onto new rootstock so that some of the original plant DNA, if you will, was still growing there. Just like that Jackson magnolia, the replacement was a graft on new rootstock of the original plant stock. So the tree planting is basically done for replacements. It is a mix of both native plants and introduced plants. One of the pictures I showed had a big ginkgo tree, which is an Asian plant. So they do a little bit of both. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to be a gardener, so put it in that context. Does the White House use organic fertilizer or is it synthetic?
Yeah.
And does that depend upon the president or what? What a political party?
Yes. Generally, they are using the least toxic chemical. This was at the time that I interviewed, so that would have been 2014, 2015. They were using the least toxic chemical to do the job, which meant they'd use organic if that was effective, and otherwise they would switch to something else.
Yeah. The second question I have, do they try and time the blooming of various shrubs so something's always in blooming
Yeah.
at every time of the year?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the trick. If you notice, the plantings that they were doing the day I visited were things that were going to stay in bloom for a long time. So, they'll put in annuals, but they do change them out seasonally. So, they try to have things always in bloom for the visitors and for the president and the president's family. Because as someone there pointed out to me, it is their home for the duration of their administration. And so they try to, I remember Laura Bush wanted Texas bluebells. Well, it's hard to grow those. They did their best, Richard Nixon wanted a California redwood. Well, they planted one and it died. It's like not everything you've got certain like biological limitations. So you get the idea.
Marta, thanks so much. Wonderful talk. Wonderful topic. I have a different kind of question for you. In our publicity for your talk, the abstract we used had a quote from your husband, Kirk, who's here, who's a member, and he attributed to you the saying, "I live, therefore I dig."
Oh,
And this is intriguing. And I wonder if you could just say a couple of sentences about your own gardens in Chatham?
yes.
Yeah, right.
So our garden is long and narrow. We have a plot which is less than a quarter acre. It's not a big area. The house was built around 1930. It has a very narrow front yard, which is deer alley. The deer walk through it basically every night. So that is my test bed. You know, if the deer don't eat it there, it's pretty tough. The back are the flowers. And then that's close to the house. Further back, I have started more of a native meadow. So native plants, as we've gotten more cognizant of the importance to pollinators of native plants. And then it goes into a woodland space, which has paths and sort of you can wander off there in the woods. It changes from day to day. It is a writer's garden, which means sometimes when I should be out there weeding, I'm sitting at my keyboard writing.
It was so interesting, but I was wondering with respect to the maintenance of the garden, do you have any idea how many people employed, how much it costs, and the approval process for getting it all done?
Yeah, so I don't know the budget. There were, at the time I visited, I think about 18 people total on staff. You know, they mow the lawns, they move the chairs. It's like the typical garden job description. It's like, oh yeah, we need somebody to set up for the party. Let's get the gardener, let's let the gardeners do it. So they're quite busy. You know, they do all the pruning. I don't know about the tree pruning. I do know that, you know, they try to keep it with people inside. I know this for two reasons, you know, people who are employed there. One is I asked, where do you get those beautiful annuals that you're planting? And the head gardener said, I can't tell you because of security issues. You're right. You imagine a nursery backing up a truck with plants. And oh, I can't remember the other thing, but at any rate, I think they basically try to keep it inside. Oh, I know. I asked if I could volunteer, right? I volunteer at a lot of different gardens. You know, it's a way. I've volunteered at Beatrix Potter's garden. I volunteered at Emily Dickinson's garden. This is a way to like get into the subject, you know, hands-on, if you will. And he said, by the time I got you security clearance, it'd be a whole new administration. We'd have to start over again. So, you know, they try to keep it just to people who are employed there for obvious security reasons.
This is perhaps slightly off topic, but how difficult was it to get into the National Archives and do all the work that you had to do there?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The very first book I wrote was about Emily Dickinson, and I had no idea how to go about getting into special collections. So the Emily Dickinson papers, you know, are in Harvard. They're at the Houghton Library. Of course, you know, different archives. I've worked at Princeton and blah, blah, blah. Basically, all you have to do is apply. That is generally the case. The only time that it was harder was the Morgan Library, where I felt like I was trying to enter FBI headquarters. You know, I needed letters of recommendation and all of these things. But generally, you just have to make an appointment and give a valid reason. And that was certainly true of the National Archives. You know, and then I worked in the Library of the Department of Agriculture, the Library of Congress, you know, the New York Public Library. If you have a reason and you follow, you know, generally there will be an application now online that you follow, you can get an appointment and use the papers. And it's sort of amazing what people will bring you. You know, they'll bring you these original documents to look at. So it's a good question.
Lee, please come up and thank Marta.
Thank you, Marta. That was great. The Old Guard has several ways to thank their speakers. The first is a certificate of appreciation, which they will probably show up top here too. If you notice, there's a picture of an orchid on it. And that's because in 1930, when the organization was formed, Summit was the orchid capital of the United States, and they raised orchids and sent them all over the country. So the Old Guard adopted it as its symbol. So that's for you to have. And for our female speakers, we also give an actual orchid. And I am sure you know how to take care of this thing better than I do. So, so that, and the third way we have of thanking our speakers is what we call the old guard salute. Thank you so much.